Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry, by Owen Barfield, 2nd edition. 12. Some Changes. In the first chapter of this book, it was pointed out that our collective representations compose not only the world of everyday experience, but also the world which, apart from the special case of physics, is investigated by the sciences. Science did not, of course, begin with the scientific revolution. But in the time before that had done its work, the world with which science had to deal was not that of our own day, but a world of the kind sketched in the last chapter. If, to take only one instance, we look at the theories concerning the blood and its circulation which prevailed before Harvey, we can at once see from their whole character that they represent the application of alpha thinking to representations quite other than our own. The background picture of man as microcosm at the center of the world as macrocosm was more than a background picture for science. There, and in particular in their chemistry, which we should now call alchemy, that picture became explicit as theory. And where it was not explicit, it was still implied. But it went further than this. Just as for us, evolution, for instance, besides being both a background picture and an explicit theory, has spread itself as a way of thinking far beyond the confines of biology, or, as mechanism has passed from physics into chemistry and physiology, so the medieval background picture of a reciprocal participation between man and the elements by which he was surrounded influenced other sciences besides alchemy. Thus, in medicine, the heart was the central organ, occupying something the same position in the microcosm of man as did man himself in the macrocosm. It drew the blood into itself in order to replenish it with pneuma, or vital spirits, after which the blood passed of its own motions back again into the system of the body. Instead of a circulation, there were two different kinds of blood, the arterial, whose function has just been described, and which contained those vital spirits to which we still unknowingly refer when we speak of high or low spirits, and the venous, which flowed back and forth in the veins, conveying nourishment. We saw in Chapter 4 that anthropologists have been particularly struck by the difference between those features which we ourselves select for attention out of the whole representation, and the features which a participating consciousness selects. This seems to be well exemplified in the case of blood, as it appeared and was known before the 17th century. The medieval mind was not particularly interested in the mechanical part of the representation. On the other hand, it was much more vividly aware than we are of a qualitative difference between arterial blood and venous blood. Are we sure we are justified in ruling out the possibility that participated venous blood and participated arterial blood really are two different kinds of fluid? It is indeed remarkable that earlier still, and down to the time of Galen, this was how it was imagined, and not as the same fluid circulating. Harvey, on the other hand, was definitely interested in the mechanism of the heart, even to the extent of talking of the heart as a piece of machinery in which, though one wheel gives motion to another, yet all the wheels seem to move simultaneously. This enabled him ultimately to demonstrate the circulation of the blood, and his discovery, like many of the discoveries made in the non-mechanical sciences, had two clearly traceable consequences. On the one hand, it corrected a number of palpable mechanical errors. For instance, the belief that air passed directly from the lungs to the heart, and that the blood flowed both ways through the veins. On the other hand, it contributed towards the bringing about of an exclusively mechanomorphic view of both blood and heart. The second consequence took effect only gradually. Harvey himself still assumed the presence of vital spirits, and he retained enough participating consciousness to write with enthusiasm on the subject of the heart as the central organ, like a sort of sun of the human body. The like enthusiasm is observable in Copernicus, writing of the macrocosmic sun, and it is clear that a relation between the two was assumed by both men. For Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood was based quite consciously upon two Aristotelian and medieval doctrines, namely, the participating and formal relation between the macrocosm and microcosm, to which I have already referred in this chapter, and the perfection of circular motion, to which I referred earlier in the book. Thus, the ousting of participation is not a logical consequence of a more accurate observation of the mechanical element in any representation. It is a practical one. If we are present at a church service, where a censer is swinging, we may either attend to the whole representation, or we may select for attention the actual movement to and fro of the censer. In the latter case, if we are a Galileo, we may discover the law of the pendulum. It is a good thing to discover the law of the pendulum. It is not such a good thing to lose, for that reason, all interest in, and ultimately even perception of, the incense whose savor it was the whole purpose of the pendulum to release. Participation ceases to be conscious precisely because we cease to attend to it. But as already pointed out, participation does not cease to be a fact because it ceases to be conscious. It merely ceases to be what I have called original participation. From a slightly different point of view, all this could be expressed by saying that words like blood and heart have shifted their meanings. In maintaining this, I shall of course be accused of confusing the word with the thing. But this is a fallacy. The real confusion lies hidden in the indictment. It is indeed possible, when thinking of the relation between words and things, to forget what things, that is, phenomena, are, namely, that they are collective representations and, as such, correlative to human consciousness. But those who decline to adopt this expedient will find it impossible to sever the thing by a sort of surgical operation from its name. The relation between collective representations and language is of the most intimate nature, and if charges of muddled thinking are to be brought, I do not hesitate to say that the boot is on the other leg. Those who insist that words and things are in two mutually exclusive categories of reality are simply confusing the phenomena with the particles. They are trying to think about the former as though they were the latter, whereas by definition it is only the unrepresented which is independent of collective human consciousness and therefore of human language. The word blood is a particularly striking example of such a shift of meaning, since it is a substance with which, as it swings to and fro from the heart and lung at the center to visible complexion and sensitive skin at the periphery, we can still in some small measure feel ourselves to be united by an extrasensory link. We can, for example, both feel within ourselves and see through the curtain of another's flesh how instantly it answers to fear and shame. Thus, we still participate originally in our own blood up to the very moment when it becomes phenomenal by being shed. From that moment on, we abandon it to the mechanomorphism which characterizes all our phenomena. For us, that is, for our casual awareness, though not for our scientific concepts, there are really two kinds of blood: the shed and the unshed. Rather, as for Galen, there were two kinds of blood, the venous and the arterial. Both Galens were participated, whereas only one of ours is. We refer to what remains of that participation when we speak with a psychological intention of bad blood or hot blood. We no longer distinguish where he did. We do distinguish where he did not, polarizing the old meaning of blood into two, a metaphorical and a literal one. And our medicine interests itself almost exclusively in the literal one, that is, in the idol. 13. The texture of medieval thought. Once the fact of participation is granted, the connection between words and things must, we have seen, be admitted to be at any time a very much closer one than the last 2 or 3 centuries have assumed. Conscious participation, moreover, will be aware of that connection, and original participation was conscious. It is only if we approach it in this light that we can hope to understand the extreme preoccupation of medieval learning with words, and with grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, logic, and all that has to do with words. For words, and particularly nouns, were not then and could not be regarded as mere words. I was taught in my first class at school to recite aloud with the rest of the class, "A noun is the name of anything," and the philosophers, from Plotinus to Aquinas, were wont to treat at the same time of words and things under the inclusive topic of names. Thus Dionysius in his De Divinis Nominibus, and Aquinas in the 13th Quaestio of Part 1 of the Summa, concerning the names of God, and in the little treatise De Natura Verbi Intellectus, and elsewhere, are both concerned not with philology, but with epistemology and metaphysics. In the last 2 chapters I have said a little of the world as it was for the common man, and a little of the world as it was for science, immediately before the scientific revolution. Now I am to say a little of the world as it was to show forth in philosophy. In all cases the plan of this book, as well as the time at my disposal both for study and for writing, have determined that little must be a very little indeed. I am only too well aware that a whole book, instead of a chapter, would not be too much to give to the philosophy alone of that lost world. Once again, it is a lost world. Although the whole purpose of this book is to show that its spiritual wealth can be, and indeed, if incalculable disaster is to be avoided, must be regained. No good can come of any attempt to hark back to the original participation from which it sprang. That lost world, then, was a world in which both phenomenon and name were felt as representations. On the one hand, the word conceived in the mind is representative of the whole of that which is realized in thought. Verbum igitur in mente conceptum est representatium omnis aegis quod actu intelligetur. But on the other hand, the phenomenon itself only achieves full reality, actus, in the moment of being named by man, that is, when that in nature which it represents is united with that in man which the name represents. Such naming, however, need not involve vocal utterance, for the name or word is not mere sound or mere ink. For Aquinas, as for Augustine, there are, anterior to the uttered word, the intellect word, the heart word, and the memory word. Verbum intellectus, verbum cordis, verbum memoriae. The human word proceeds from the memory, as the divine word proceeds from the Father. Proceeds from it, yet remains one with it, for the world is the thought of God realized through his word. Thus, the divine word is also forma exemplaris. The phenomena are its representations, as the human word is the representation of intellectus in actu. But once again, the phenomenon itself only achieves its full reality, actus, in being named or thought by man. For thinking in act is the thing thought in act, just as the senses in act are the things sensed in act. Intellectus in actu est intelligibil in actu, sicut sensus in actu est sensibil in actu. And elsewhere, St. Thomas expressly ratifies the dictum of Aristotle in his De Anima, that the soul is in a manner all things. Anima est quodammodo omnia. It is against a background of thoughts like these, and of the collective representations on which they were based, that we must see the medieval conception of the 7 liberal arts, with grammar at their head, followed immediately by rhetoric and dialect. To learn about the true nature of words was at the same time to learn about the true nature of things, and it was the only way. We may reflect how the meaning of the word grammar itself has been polarized, since the scientific revolution, into the study of mere words on the one hand, and, on the other, into the half-magical grammari, which altered its form to glamour, and was useful for a season to the poets before it was debased. One may reflect also on the frequent appearances made by grammar and the other liberal arts as persons in medieval allegory, and how easily and naturally they mingle there with the strange figure of the goddess Natura, at once so like and so unlike the Persephone of Greek mythology. This might easily lead us into a consideration of allegory itself, a literary form which is so little to our taste, and yet was so popular and all-pervasive in the Middle Ages. Is it not clear that we find allegory desiccated precisely because, for us, mere words are themselves desiccated, or rather because, for us, words are mere? For us, the characters in an allegory are personified abstractions. But for the man of the Middle Ages, grammar or rhetoric, mercy or danger, were real to begin with, simply because they were names. And names could be representations in much the same solid-feeling way as things were. For this very reason, we are in some danger of confusing their allegory with the symbolism in which we ourselves are again beginning to be interested, or at least of judging them by the same standards. This is an error. Symbolism often expresses itself in language, as so much else does, though it can also express itself through other media. Yet the essence of symbolism is not that words or names as such, but that things or events themselves are apprehended as representations. But this, as we have seen, is the normal way of apprehension for a participating consciousness. Our symbolical, therefore, is an approximation to, or a variant of, their literal. Even when they got down to the bedrock of literal, they still experienced that rock as a representation. And so Aquinas, in dealing with the use of language in Holy Scripture, first divides its meaning into literal and spiritual, and then subsumes the allegorical and certain other interpretations under the heading of spiritual. But when he comes to the sensus parabolicus, which is our symbolical, he includes it in the literal, sub literati continitur. When, for example, in the Bible, the right arm of God is spoken of, it is not the figure, but the figured, which is the literal meaning. All this will bear some meditation. Indeed, to understand how the word literal has changed its meaning is to understand the heart of the matter. For our problem is precisely to transport ourselves into the interior of minds for which the ordinary way of looking at and of thinking about phenomena was to look at and to think about them as appearances, representations. For which, therefore, knowledge was defined not as the devising of hypotheses, but as an act of union with the represented behind the representation. And it is only by reconstructing in the imagination, and not just in theory, the nature of the representations they confronted, that we can hope to really understand the mode of their thinking. If we approach it from this end, instead of, as is usual, by way of our own representations and our own consequent distortions of the then meanings of their terms, then the scholastic terminology does indeed spring into life for us. Form and matter, actus and potentia, species, essence, existence, the active and the passive intelligence, and the rest. We must forget all about our laws of nature, those interposed spectral hypotheses, before we can understand the forms of medieval scholasticism. For the forms determined the appearances, not as laws do, but rather as a soul determines a body. And indeed, the animal and human soul was defined as the form of the body. We must forget all about causality, as we understand it, if we want to understand how the form was also causa exemplaris. But there is not anything to forget, for we have not even transmuted survival of that actus potentia polarity, which was the very lifeblood of scholastic thought, central in its heart and manifest through its capillaries at all points of its surface organism. Being is potential existence. Existence actualizes being. Yet in the universe, actus precedes potentia. For out of potentiality, a subject cannot be brought except by a being that is actual. The being of God is wholly actual, and is at the same time his existence. But for creatures, it is only their existence which actualizes not their own being, but the being of God, which they participate. Everywhere around us we must see creatures in a state of potentia being raised to actus, and yet, behind the appearances, the actus is already there. What is the intellectual soul but the potentiality of determining the species of things? And what are the phenomena themselves? Actually, the likenesses or representations of all sorts of species, but potentially, that is, in the condition described as in potentia, immaterial in the soul itself. Phenomena and mind in perpetual interplay, with species hovering somewhere between them as the moment in which the one becomes the other. Anima enim quasi transformata est in rem per speciem. Knowledge, for such a consciousness, was conceived of as the perfection or completion of the naming process of thought. In ordinary thinking or speaking, as in perception, the participation was a half-conscious process, but knowledge was an actual union with the represented behind the representation. The knowledge of things that are is the things. Cognito eorum quae sunt e quae sunt est, wrote John Scotus Erigena in the 9th century, quoting Dionysius. Nothing, wrote Aquinas, is known except truth, which is the same as being. Nihil enim scitur nisi verum quod cum ente convertitur. Or, as a mean between potentia and actus, it was the process of actualization of the soul's potentiality to become what it contemplated, and thus a stage on its journey back to God. God's own knowledge was alike the cause of all things and identical with his substance, and man participated in the being of God. Indeed, it was only by virtue of that participation that he could claim to have any being. Now, participation as an actual experience is only to be won for our islanded consciousness of today by special exertion. It is a matter not of theorizing, but of imagination in the genial or creative sense of the word, and therefore our first glimpse of it is commonly an aesthetic experience of some sort, derived from poetry or painting. And yet this experience, so foreign to our habit, is one which we positively must acquire and apply before we can hope to understand the thought of any philosopher earlier than the scientific revolution. Without it, we shall not really understand what they mean when they use the commonest terms, species and genus, form and matter, subject and accident, cause and effect. Instead, we shall clumsily substitute a meaning of our own. In the work of Thomas Aquinas in particular, the word participate, or participation occurs almost on every page, and a whole book could be written, indeed one has been written, on the uses he makes of it. It is not a technical term of philosophy, and he is no more concerned to define it than a modern philosopher would be to define some such common tool of his thought as, say, the word compare. Only in one passage from the whole of his voluminous works, according to M. Geiger, did he feel it necessary to indicate its meaning, and this he did principally by illustrating it. Thus, after telling us that the species participates the genus, and the accident the subject, that matter participates form, and effect participates cause, he gives us a glimpse of what all these participations signify to him by adding, suppose we say that air participates the light of the sun, because it does not receive it in that clarity in which it is in the sun. At one end of the scale, the subject participates its predicate. At the other end, a formal or hierarchical participation per similitudinem was the foundation of the whole structure of the universe, for all creatures were, in a greater or lesser degree, images or representations, or names, of God, and their likeness or unlikeness did not merely measure, but was the nearer or more distant emanation of His being and goodness in them. It was a spiritual structure, and much of it lay beyond the world of appearance altogether. Angels, for example, are not simply the subject of a separate work or a separate chapter of the Summa, but occur everywhere in it, and are as likely to be referred to in a purely epistemological as in a cosmological context. It will be well to point out here that, if I have concentrated on one particular medieval philosopher rather than attempted a conspectus of the whole field of medieval philosophy or theories of knowledge, it is because that is the method which a history of consciousness, as distinct from a history of ideas, must adopt. It must attempt to penetrate into the very texture and activity of thought, rather than to collate conclusions. It is concerned, semantically, with the way in which words are used, rather than with the product of discourse. Expressed in terms of logic, its business is more with the proposition than with the syllogism, and more with the term than with the proposition. Therefore it must particularize. It must choose some one, or at best a few points, for its penetration. It is a question of making the best choice, and to me the best choice seemed to be the language and thought of Thomas Aquinas. I could probably have found more sensational illustrations of participation in, for example, Erigena or Albertus. For the Arabians, participation, with a particular intellectual emphasis, was so complete as practically to exclude individual human identity. I should, I think, have found fewer illustrations among the nominalists, but they can fairly be regarded as forerunners of the scientific revolution, in whom the decline of participation cast its shadow before. Moreover, in the mind of Aquinas, with his enormous erudition, the whole corpus of medieval thought is, in a manner, recapitulated, and he is as sober as he is profound.